Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So my name is Andrew Reilly. While here at BU, I double majored in Italian and linguistics and international relations. And I'd really like to thank my advisor, Professor Nancy Harowitz, who guided me on this project, which is entitled Babel in the Neapolitan Metropolis, an analysis of linguistic representation and purpose in Ferrante's Geniale series. So to give you a bit of background of how I got into this project, I'm very fascinated by the linguistic diversity in Italy. So in addition to standard Italian, which is spoken throughout the peninsula, it's the language that I learn in the classroom, that is necessary for communication in the government, in education, with media. There are also many regional languages throughout the peninsula that are still spoken today. And those are represented in the map that I have here on the screen, with each color representing a different language group, and each shade within that color representing a different dialect or variety of that language. And colloquially, these regional languages are referred to as dialects in everyday talk in Italian. And in one of my Italian courses here at BU, I was really interested to see how this situation was reflected in the contemporary Italian literature, specifically in L'Amica Geniale, which is the first book in a series, which in English have been translated as the Neapolitan novels. It consists of 4 books. They're all amazing. You should all read them. And they're written by an author named Elena Ferrante. And this is a pen name. We're not really sure her true identity, but we do know that she was raised in Naples. And this makes sense because the series is primarily set in Naples, following 2 primary protagonists, Elena and Lila. They are raised in the 1950s in Naples, really in abject poverty, and it chronicles their lives through the 2010s. In many ways, these 2 female protagonists are foils to one another. So Elena ends up leaving the poor neighborhood that she grew up in. She earns her doctorate in Italian and becomes a really respected literary figure and author, whereas Lila remains within the neighborhood and does not get anything past an elementary school education. And throughout the series, characters are constantly positioning themselves linguistically. They're speaking in Italian, or they're speaking in dialect, which here would mean Neapolitan, or they have accents. And so this led me to my research question: for what purpose does Ferrante employ linguistic differentiation throughout the course of the series? And so to really answer this question, I read all 4 books, both in Italian and in English, and I sort of compiled all the data, making notes of every single time that something having to do with language was mentioned. So I put it all in sort of a crazy spreadsheet and made sure to look at the language very closely to see how dialect, how accents, how Italian was being described and used. And this collection of data allowed me to come up with 3 main categories for which language was really working under. So one was la questione della lingua, which warrants a lot more explanation than I'm able to give it here, but it essentially was a literary debate originating in the Renaissance, and it allowed standard Italian to flourish and become the language that we know and love today. I also found that language interacts with place in interesting ways. It constructs the boundaries of place. It can sometimes dissolve the boundaries of place. And it can also move place from its point of origin to, say, another city in the Italian peninsula. And also identity. Characters, when they're speaking, are projecting an image of themselves to other characters and to the reader of the text. And to give you a little snapshot of what I did for my paper, I wanted to take us to a scene in one of the books where identity is really examined. So to contextualize this scene a little bit, I said earlier that Lila and Elena are foils to one another, so keep that in mind. At this point, the 2 girls are sort of early teenage years. Elena is about to enter high school, and we remember Lila does not get anything past an elementary school education, so she's in the workforce at this point. And the 2 of them are walking in the neighborhood, the poor neighborhood where they grew up, and this older guy named Marcello, he's also uneducated. He's sort of involved with a crime syndicate, and he's older than the 2 girls as well. And so he begins to talk to them in dialect with sort of some sexual overtones. He's trying to get the 2 girls to come into the car with him and his brothers. It seemed as sort of a dangerous situation. And Elena and Lila have very different ways of responding to this perceived threat. So first we have Elena. So she narrates the series, and she says, "I turned, and out of a need to feel attractive and lucky and on the verge of going to the rich people's school, said in Italian, 'Thank you, but we can't.'" So when we look at the words that Elena is using that are sort of associated with Italian, we see that she feels more attractive when she speaks it, she feels more lucky when she speaks it, and she also is associating herself with the rich people that she's sort of going to be brushing elbows with when she goes to high school. And so with these words, you can argue that Elena believes herself to be better when she's speaking Italian, when she's responding to Marcello's dialect with this Italian. And so her way of stopping him is to say, listen, I'm better than you, so therefore you shouldn't be associating yourself with me. Please stop. But this doesn't work. This isn't effective. And so that prompts this response from Lila, where she later goes, Lila, half the size of him, pushed him against the car and whipped the shoemaker's knife under his throat. She said calmly, in dialect, touch her again and I'll show you what happens. Marcello, incredulous, froze. And so we see here that Lila is obviously much more effective in that she stops Marcello, she sort of neutralizes the threat, and she really does this by adopting the cultural projection that Marcello has used earlier in the scene when she's using dialect, when he's using dialect and she's using it in response. Dialect is more familiar to Marcello, so her words mean something more than when Elena uses Italian. Dialect is also sort of the language of the working class, and this is only emphasized when Lila is using a shoemaker's knife. She's not using a piece of cutlery or a knife that's really meant as a weapon. She's using quite literally the tool from which she derives her living. So that's just one example of some of the close reading and analysis that I did in my paper. I think that going forward, the work that I've done provides framework through which you can analyze Ferrante's body of work. She's written numerous books that sort of deal with similar themes, so it would certainly be interesting to take and further this project in that direction. I also think it would be interesting to do a comparative study with other contemporary Italian authors. You know, it would be interesting to see if they use language and dialect in the same way, specifically with migrant Italian literature. And migrant Italian literature is those works that are written by those who are not of Italian ethnicity, but they write in Italian. So a good example would be Ija Bashego. She's Italian-born, Italian nationality, but she's of Somali origin. Or Amar Lacous, who immigrated to Italy from Algeria. And with that, I welcome any questions.
Do you have any thoughts on what the future of a lot of these dialects is going to look like? I know you spoke about how a lot of they're being marginalized in favor of standard Italian, but do you have any sense of how are any being more marginalized than others? What do you see as being the development of these dialects and their usage in the next 10, 20 years?
Right, it's a good question. This project actually originated with me looking at the legislative framework of those dialects in Italy. In recent years, we've seen a lot of these dialects have sort of regional official status as well, in addition to Italian. And you know, in my initial stages of that research, I found that those laws don't really have any teeth because at this point, Italian is so favored in formal situations that the dialect really can't compete with it in that sense. And so I think with a lot of minority languages, the fate is sort of grim. To sort of counteract against that, it would really involve a lot of grassroots organization and funding, and a lot of these communities don't really have access to that.
I noticed on one of your slides that the images were from presumably an HBO
yes.
take.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens to the dialect in the translation from the novel to the HBO series?
Right, so it's actually very interesting because in the original Italian text, dialect is not used. It's just explicitly said, you know, this person said such and such in dialect or in Italian. And so the HBO show is interesting because they do use dialect in the show. And so even when Italian viewers watch it in Italy, there are subtitles for the part that is in dialect because the people who aren't from the Naples area are, you know, they're not going to understand it. It's a completely different language. Yeah.
Andrew, the beautiful example that you led us through really showed how language choices come up under threat, and particularly within like structural elements of gender and class. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, if your view of what's going on politically in the novel with respect to class and gender changed at all with close scrutiny of language and dialect?
Right, so upon initially reading the series, I really thought that, well, listen, Elena is a highly educated narrator, and I felt that oftentimes she would put the dialect down when she was sort of conveying the story. But when I read other parts of the series, I sort of realized that Ferrante is doing interesting things where she's, by constantly mentioning the dialect, she's really elevating it to a position where, like, it can be seen as a fully fledged language on par with that of Italian. And that was certainly a change in my perspective as I further analyzed the series. Yeah. All right, thank you so much.